welcome everybody. Thank you for joining in for today's RAVENNA webinar on timing and synchronization in AES67 and SMPTE ST 2110. My name is Andreas Hildebrand. I'm working for ALC NetworX out of Munich. We are the RAVENNA guys. RAVENNA is an IP media networking technology which has seen the light exactly at IBC 2010, 10 years ago. So we are celebrating the 10th year or the 10th anniversary of RAVENNA. With me today is an absolute expert from the industry, from the timing and synchronization industry. It's Daniel Boldt, who is head of software development at Meinberg. Meinberg is a company has been established in 1979 in Germany, and they are focused on everything time and frequency synchronization. They contributed to a lot of standardization bodies, namely, of course, the IEEE 1588, which defined the precision time protocol. So one quick word on housekeeping. If you have a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A function, which you should have available on your desktop control or web browser control. We'll be happy to discuss and answer them at the end. With us, keeping track of all questions today is Roland Hemming from Copperleaf in the UK. All right. Without further ado, let's jump right into the topic, timing and synchronization. We are talking about audio and video transport over IP, and of course we need synchronization and have a timing requirement. So what are the general requirements when it comes to media over IP? So first of all, we definitely want to have any media type transported in full bit transparency. So that rules out sample rate conversion, and that also means if we don't have sample rate conversion, all streams, at least those which need to be connected between sender and receiver, have to run on the same media clock. And with the same, we mean not just nominally, let's say 48 kilohertz, but exactly the same media clock. Otherwise, there will be slips or pops audible, and we would have to employ a sample rate conversion again. That's definitely what we want to avoid. So of course, on a network, we don't want to run just one single sample frequency. We want to run a multitude of sample rates at the same time. Some devices communicate at 48 kilohertz, others might communicate at 96. Video, again, uses 90 kilohertz clock. So we definitely want to have different sample rates on the network. In professional applications, we require absolute low end-to-end latency, definitely something below the 10 milliseconds range, for audio at least. And of course, we want to make sure that we can precisely time align the content among different streams to a sample accuracy. So, and of course, if we have the network already in place, we don't want to run an extra cable around distributing a clock reference like the house clock distribution, running a word clock blackburst or anything else. So synchronization information definitely has to run on the same network where we are also distributing the media content. So all of these requirements definitely rule out any clock reassembly from watching or looking at the incoming stream data, because you can synchronize on one incoming stream, but if two incoming streams have different word clock reference or media clock reference, you definitely can't align them anymore. So clock reassembly from just decoding an incoming stream is not appropriate. Also not appropriate is the distribution of a master clock beat, so just the frequency, because with just the frequency, we can't time align anything on the network. So what we definitely need to have in such a setup is a common understanding of absolute time within all of the participating devices. So we all have to run against the same wall clock. So this is the general requirements, and let's have a quick look at the accuracy requirements in such an environment. If we look at video and audio, we will easily identify that audio applications have the highest time and accuracy and precision demands. If we want to align any two streams sample accurately, we need to have a time precision of at least plus minus half a sample. Otherwise, we can't achieve sample accurate alignment. So at 48 kilohertz, this is an absolute time of plus minus 10 microseconds. And if we increase the sample rate, we of course have smaller time requirements for the absolute time precision. Now then there's another standard which is called AES11, which tells about the maximum deviation a master clock, an audio master clock, is allowed to have, and that calls for plus minus 5% maximum jitter wonder against the reference. So at 48 kilohertz, that already means that we are now down in a range of plus minus 1 microsecond absolute time precision of the network. And if we go higher up, let's say 192 kilohertz, we already need 250 nanoseconds of precision within any device on the network. So how do we actually achieve this synchronization and this kind of precision? The base requirement is that all nodes are running local clocks, and these local clocks have to precisely synchronized against a common wall clock using the precision time protocol, or quickly PTP. Now, you need to know that PTP has several versions. The first version was standardized in 2002, the PTP version 1. And the most current, well, I would say the current version is PTP version 2, which has been standardized in 2008. And you will learn in a second from Daniel what is coming up with precision time protocol and how this actually works. One word at the beginning: precision time protocol version 1 and version 2 are not directly compatible with each other. So, and that's actually the point where Daniel is taken over. And Daniel, you should be able to take it from here, explaining a bit more about the PTP and what is currently going on in the standards.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. Let me check if you see the screen now, the correct screen.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Very good.
So let me talk a little bit about PTP and what it actually is. PTP is a standard sponsored by the IEEE Instrumentation and Measurement Society. And this standard, called IEEE 1588, includes the protocol PTP, called the Precision Time Protocol. The current version, as Andreas already said, is PTP version 2, released 2008. That's why it's called 1588-2008. The previous version was version 1, released in 2002. And the latest version is has been balloted for a standard in 2019, is now called PTP version 2.1. Y.1, I will come to this point a little bit later, just to emphasize that there is a compatibility here to version 2. This is the final draft. There are no changes to this revision anymore, but it's not yet published. It's supposed to be published within the next few months. So what does PTP allow? It allows accurate sub-microsecond time and frequency transfer. This is different from previous versions of network-based time protocols like NTP, the Network Time Protocol, which was designed to work over the internet, over wide area connections, to arrange an accuracy of around a couple of milliseconds. This was not enough for a large number of different applications. That's why PTP was created. It has already been widely used in several Ethernet-based applications, also in different industries like telecom, power, the financial industry, in the test and measurement community, industrial automation, and now, as you all know, audio over IP, and of course, broadcasting environments like TV studios. It is a highly generic standard, but it can be customized via so-called PTP profiles, so that every industry gets its optimal set of parameters for their needs. The question that always comes up is what makes actually PTP so precise? The simple answer is hardware timestamping in the first place, but what does that mean actually? On one side, you have the so-called PTP grandmaster, and these components reflect the different components in a server that can act as a grandmaster. You have the higher network layers where the so-called PTP software stack is running, and you have on the lower layers the network interface card. And this is a special network interface card that is divided in two different parts. So one part is the so-called MAC, and the other part is the so-called PHY component. So this is exactly the moment where the digital signal is transformed into an analog signal before it just goes out on the cable. And between these two components, a highly accurate clock is listening to the traffic and detects a PTP packet, takes a very highly accurate timestamp of it. It can be a single-digit nanosecond accurate timestamp, and informs the PTP stack in the operating system, running in the operating system, about the exact moment the packet left the device. On the other side, there's the so-called PTP slave. It does exactly the same thing, but just the other way around. So you also have the component of the MAC and the PHY. The incoming packet is timestamped, very accurate, and this timestamp is also taken into the higher layers. But there is an unknown network in between, and this network could destroy everything that has been done to achieve a very high level of accuracy. But to overcome this problem, the network components must do the same thing as the so-called ordinary clocks master and slave do. So a PTP-aware switch will do exactly the same by timestamping the incoming packets and also timestamping the outgoing packets. And like here with the transparent clock switch, just measure the time the packet stayed within the switch, so that the queuing time or the so-called residence time within the switch is compensated. And if every node from master to slave is consequently doing this, then you can achieve an accuracy from master to slave that is better than 100 or even better than 50 nanoseconds. So how does the PTP message exchange actually work? You have on one side the grandmaster that is sending out a so-called sync message. And the moment the sync message is leaving the master, a timestamp T1 is taken. And on the slave side, at the moment the sync message arrives, the timestamp T2 is taken here on the other side. Afterwards, the slave is sending out a so-called delay request packet. And the moment the packet leaves the device, a timestamp is taken and stored locally in that unit. And upon request, at the master side, a fourth timestamp is taken. And this fourth timestamp now is sent back with an informational message called the so-called delay response. So on the slave side, you have 4 timestamps, and then you have two different formulas to calculate the clock offset, so the actual time error of the slave clock compared to the master clock, and the delay, so the time it took for the packet to travel from master to slave. With these two formulas, you can calculate these two values, and you can then easily adjust your local clock. So in other words, just to make it clear what is actually meant, the sync message just tells you it's roughly this time. If you have a so-called two-step clock, then another packet is sent out just after the sync message, which actually means when I said it was that time, it was actually very precisely this time. So this two-step clock mechanism was necessary in the early days of PTP, where you did not have such a powerful hardware so that the sync message could be adjusted with the accurate timestamp at the moment it was so-called flying through the MAC chip before it went out to the network, and therefore the follow-up packet was needed. With today's hardware, it is not so necessary anymore. Today's powerful FPGA components can do a one-step master clock. So the follow-up message is not so of importance today, but still many devices still are compliant with only doing a two-step approach, and therefore, of course, the devices have to do both mechanisms. So the delay request then tells you, tell me when you receive this. I store the timestamp as soon as the message leaves. And the delay response tells you, I got your last message at this particular point in time. And then again, you have the 4 timestamps, and you can then calculate offset and delay. To determine within a network who is actually the best clock that is allowed to provide the synchronization for your clients, the so-called best master clock algorithm is used, or BMCA. The BMCA makes sure that the own data set of a clock or a node is compared with the data sets of the currently active master. And the following order is always taken care of. So the priority 1 is the first value to check. It's a user configurable value between 0 and 255, where the lower value will always win. So if you configure a device with a priority 1 of 1, and you configure another device with a priority 1 of 2, then the device with the value 1 will always win the best master clock algorithm without checking any other parameters. So this is a very dangerous value to change, of course, and it's mostly not recommended to change this value, at least not among the potential masters. The second value to check is the clock class. The clock class represents the state of the reference clock. Here are a couple of examples listed. So clock class of 6 means that the system is locked to a primary reference. Clock class 7 means that the system is in holdover. And clock class 52 means that since startup, the clock has never synchronized. The next parameter to check is the clock accuracy. It represents the phase accuracy of the clock compared to a known reference. And especially in the startup phase of a clock, this value decreases as the oscillator of that clock settles to the right value. So in the beginning, you might have a value that is saying I'm better than 1 microsecond, and then goes step by step better to 100 nanoseconds. The next value to check is the clock variance. The clock variance represents the stability of the clock, so it's a kind of short-term stability value. This value is oscillator dependent, and the value itself is usually vendor specific. So different vendors might have different values for the different classes of clocks they use. After those parameters, number 2, 3, and 4 are automatically determined by the clock itself. There is another user configurable parameter, which is the priority 2. This is a value that can be entered between 0 and 255 again. And this value is actually very useful if you want to prefer one device over the other one, as soon as they are both running on the same accuracy level and on the same status. And if everything is equal, the last value to check is the so-called UUID. It's a unique identifier, which is usually based on the MAC address of the PTP port, where the lower MAC address wins the BMCA. If you look into the startup procedure of a PTP node, the PTP node will first always go into listening state. And if there is a default clock class of 248 configured, which you can see on the right side, then you can then this unit will either go into slave state if there is an announced message from a better master available, or it will become the grandmaster for this network if no announce message from a better master is available, or no announce message can be seen at all. So these roles can change between slave and master if you use a clock class of either 248 or some value between 128 and 255. There are reserved ranges of the clock class. For example, if you have a potential master clock, then this master clock will usually have a clock class value lower than 128, where this clock can only be either master or passive, but never slave. And the other extreme is that the clock class is set to slave only, which would set its clock class to 255. Then this clock can be slave only, but never master. This is very important when you have a network, when you have a network where you know that some of these devices should never be a master in your network, then the slave only option of these devices, usually end devices or end nodes, should be set. So what is important when you plan your infrastructure? You need to know that transmission delays of the packets are out to be constant. Usually they have different delays between two different endpoints within the network, as you all know. In general, of course, over-provisioning of the network must always be avoided. You must know your limits in hardware architectures of the network devices, and it can be, those problems could be sometimes mitigated by prioritizing PDP traffic, but this is really the simplest way to improve the situation a bit, and should not be considered as the only actions to be taken when you plan your infrastructure. So you always should take care that you always plan your network architecture according to your planned load that you have in your network. So if you make sure that your network switches are not fully loaded, or at least less than 60–70%, then you can be sure that you can reach a level of accuracy that might be acceptable, but never be guaranteed. The best thing to do is to use PTP-aware network devices, switches, routers that are either transparent clocks or boundary clocks. And these two concepts are now explained a little bit in more detail. So here you can see the general concept of a PTP boundary clock. It looks a little bit complicated, but it's not too complicated, I hope, when you look at the details. The most important thing when you want to explain what a boundary clock is, that it is always terminating the PTP packets at each port and regenerates the PTP packet on another port. So a boundary clock usually is slave at one port and master on all other ports. So a real slave is synchronizing a local internal clock, and a PTP controller is then taking care of the fact that the sync messages, the announce messages, are regenerated and sent out on the remaining master ports. So a boundary clock contains a real clock inside. This is really something that is important to know. So what actually happens when there is a state change during a failover, for example? Then you must need to know how a boundary clock actually changes its states at each port. So the master is connected at one port of the boundary clock, and this port is in slave state. All other ports are in master state and are synchronizing the downstream PTP slaves. So what actually happens if the connection to the master breaks up or the master goes down? Then it will be the case that all other ports, including the boundary clock ports and the slave ports, are going into the listening state and just check what's going on, and all announce their clock properties with their own announce messages until a new master is found according to the best master clock algorithm. Now a new master is found excuse me. and it will be master to another port on the boundary clock, and this boundary clock will then be again master for all the slaves. And of course, this concept can be cascaded. On the other hand, we have the concept of a so-called transparent clock. The difference can be seen by just looking also at the arrows. So these arrows represent a sync message that is passed transparently through the switch. It just is at one of the input ports. The so-called sync arrival triggers a timestamping unit and timestamps a packet at the ingress port, and at the egress port another timestamp is taken, and only the difference is propagated within the packet. So if you have a so-called two-step transparent clock, then a follow-up packet will be sent afterwards. And it's also important to mention that if you have a two-step transparent clock and you have only a one-step master as an input, then the two-step transparent clock is responsible for generating a follow-up packet on its own. So there have been experiences with transparent clocks in the past where this was not correctly done. So a two-step master clock had to be used at that particular switch type. So if you get any problems with a transparent clock, then the stepness should always be checked if this is actually working. So how does this work? You have the master, you have some slaves, and you have a switch. A sync message is sent out by the master, and at the moment the packet arrives at the switch, a timestamp is taken, and this timestamp is stored in the timestamp memory. As soon as the packet leaves the switch on another port, a second timestamp is taken, and these two timestamps are just subtracted from each other, and the difference is added in the so-called correction field. So it's accumulated. If there is already a value inside this correction field, the new difference will just be added, so that you can also have several transparent clock switches in a row. The correction value is always be accumulated. Then this packet leaves the switch, and the slave can make use of it. If it looks at the correction field, it can just remove or subtract this value from the timestamp, so that the uncertainty of the switch is removed here. So just a short summary about the PTP-aware network devices. A boundary clock is an active PTP device where the local clock is synchronized to the grandmaster. Every port acts as a PTP node, and the time is regenerated and forwarded to all of the slaves. In contrast to that, the transparent clock is a passive PTP device. The residence time is just measured for every PTP packet. Timestamps are drawn at ingress and egress, and the difference is added to the so-called correction field. So there are some pros and cons. We are often asked, what can you recommend? Should we use a boundary clock? Should we use a transparent clock? We cannot give a definite answer to this. It depends on the hierarchy, it depends on the infrastructure planning, number of slaves, and on, of course, the chosen brands of the switches. From the concept of in terms of the standard, there is no difference in the achievable accuracy between a boundary clock and a transparent clock. As soon as they are properly implemented, you should reach the same level of accuracy regardless which type of PTP-aware switch you use. But of course there are differences, but they are usually vendor specific, implementation specific, and must be checked in a live environment. Usually a boundary clock is good for hierarchical systems. They scale well with a number of devices because you only have the communication between the links and from port to port, from hop to hop. And so there is much less traffic. They can translate between different media, but as they are real clocks, cascaded systems require special attention, and it requires continuous monitoring. Transparent clocks allow simple deployment, but and minimal monitoring, and the accuracy is independent of the network topology, but it scales poorly with the number of devices because the master sees all the slaves as the delay requests from the slaves transparently pass through till they reach the master. This is usually not a problem if you have a very powerful master, like the ones from the company that I represent. But in general, the number of packets that can be seen within the network is very high, which should sometimes also be avoided. In a 2110 capable environment, usually redundant networks come into play, where you have a primary network and a secondary network. And this redundancy is sometimes built up according to the standard SMPTE ST 2022-7. So it allows seamless switching from the primary to the secondary network as all of the traffic is duplicated. So not only the streams are duplicated, but also of course the PTP packets. And here you have a very sophisticated approach where you connect PTP grandmasters via so-called PTP feeder switches that allow only PTP communication and nothing else to both the primary and the secondary network. And with this approach, you can ensure that the end nodes will always see one single grandmaster, the best grandmaster, even if multiple failures in your network occur. So for example, if you lose GPS reception on one of the grandmasters and simultaneously lose either one switch or the end node loses one connection to one of the networks, then it can happen that some of the devices are locked to one grandmaster and some of the devices could be locked to the second grandmaster. But according to this redundancy concept, where you have the feeder switches and an additional interconnection that can also be achieved between the two grandmasters, like it's also possible with Meinberg devices, then you can always be sure that all the PTP devices are on the same phase accuracy. So there are several levels of redundancy that you can achieve, of course, at different security levels and of course different price ranges. But the options of the redundancy that you can achieve are very have a great variety here. So if you have any specific questions regarding redundancy concept, please contact us afterwards, then we can find a solution, of course. So, and at the end of my part of the presentation, I would like to give an outlook of the next revision of the PTP standard, the so-called PTP version 2.1 revision. I wrote "Don't panic." So many of you know the differences between version 1 and version 2, and the differences have been so high so that version 1 grandmaster will not be able to synchronize the version 2 slave and vice versa. And this, by every means, should be provided and should be prohibited when the new revision 2.1 was planned. So whatever was done in the standardization process, it had to be ensured that the version 2.1 will always be backwards compatible with version 2. And this is actually what happened. So new features are always optional, and the old features of version 2 work as before. Some examples of what has changed. For example, now it's possible to do some kind of profile isolation. And the profile isolation means that you can have different profiles within the same network, although they share the same domain number. So you could have a SMPTE profile with domain 0, and you could have a power profile or telecom profile with domain 0 in parallel, and they would not see each other because they have different IDs. So every standardization organization gets its own so-called standardization development organization identity. And this ID is inserted in one of the reserved fields within the common PTP message header, and it's given to a standards organization, and they can do what they want. So every profile will then have the full range of domain numbers, and it will, although it will be completely isolated from other profiles. Another feature is that interaction among domains should be possible now. So one of the drawbacks of the PTP standards have been that the current grandmaster is always right. So you must follow one grandmaster, and if this grandmaster would tell you that I'm the best, I'm perfectly accurate to GPS, then you have to take the time what this grandmaster is distributing. And even if this grandmaster sends out the wrong time, you have to believe him, and as a slave take it as it is. So now with the new concept in PTP version 2.1, you can have different domains from different grandmasters distributing to a slave simultaneously across the network, and then you can create a so-called robust clock, a multi-domain clock within the slave, where you can detect a false ticker, in this example the third grandmaster here on the right hand side, and just choose one of the green grandmasters that have the same time base or share a time that is at least near to each other. So with this concept, you can easily detect a false ticker in your network. So a summary of the new features of PTP version 2.1. I only mentioned 2 of them, but there are many more. So security has been integrated into the PTP packet. So there is a so-called security TLV created that can be appended after a PTP packet, so that you can do authentication between master and slave with an accompanied key exchange mechanism. There have been some metrics added to do some statistics. There have been some slave port monitoring methods be defined. Of course, there are others out in the field, but the standard also will find a few things. And there will be some features of accuracy added. So you can manually configure a PTP port according to a well-known asymmetry value that is present at this port. This is used for calibration. And layer 1 synchronization is also part now of one of the features, which allows a more accurate, overall accurate synchronization accuracy for specialized applications. And it will allow some features for flexibility, for example, modular transparent clocks, special ports for timing transfer, where you want to transfer the timing via a medium that is outside of the scope of the PTP protocol. And the mixed multicast and unicast operation is also now standardized, which was already present in some profiles, but has been taken over to the general standard. And still the message, the backwards compatibility to V2 remains. It is ensured so that a V2 slave will always sync to V2 master. And at this point, I would like to hand over to Andreas again.
Thank you for this very interesting insight, particularly in the upcoming new version 2.1 edition, and letting us all know that we don't have to worry about any incompatibilities that we did experience when we changed from version 1 to version 2. Okay, now since Daniel has explained how all the PTP stuff is working, now we have to turn back to our media systems and see how we apply all these nice features which are provided with PTP. So back to our synchronization and media clocks chart, we have now precisely synchronized local clocks in every device. And if we have precise time in our devices, we can generate any desired media clock locally inside those devices. So here's a quick illustration. We have a master clock on the system. We have a number of slave clocks, our end devices on the system. Those are synchronized through PTP. Of course, there can be a number of switches in between. There can be other master clocks, standby clocks, and so on. But the key message here is all these slave nodes have exactly the same time as the master clocks, and they also carry the same time among them, so to say. So once you look at a particular device, you can generate a media clock. And if you generate the same nominal media clock, from the very same time in those devices, independently from each other, you have the accurate same media clock on all the devices. So that's the idea, how to generate the absolute precise same media clocks on all devices. Now, with this principle, you could easily understand that we can generate any desired media clock. We just have to tell a device which media clock it should work with, or generate actually. And of course, on the network, concurrent operation of different media clocks is possible, as we do not distribute any media clock at all. We're just distributing the time and can generate any media clock which we need. Phase accuracy, as required by AES11 for clock master devices, is achievable, as Daniel just mentioned, by deploying PTP-aware switches. So it's important to state that distribution of PTP does not per se require PTP-aware switches. It's perfectly running also on non-PTP-aware switches. But if you go for highest accuracy, like AES11, matching AES11 standard requirements, it would be wise to deploy PTP-aware switches, boundary clocks, or time transparent clocks somewhere in the network. If you need to synchronize across different facilities, maybe even on different continents in this world, there is one master reference available just everywhere. That is GPS, which serves International Atomic Time. So if you want to have the absolute same time in Washington and Frankfurt, just use GPS reference grandmasters, and there you go. There's no need to distribute PTP across any wide area networking or internet connections. And now back to the secrets, actually. When we look at the media data, the essence data, so the audio samples or the video frames, then of course we have to use the locally generated media clock to sample this data in. So at the point of sampling, each sample essentially receives a generation timestamp reflecting the accurate absolute wall clock time of its instantiation into the network. Actually, if we look a bit more deeper, it gets a bit more complicated, but it's easy to understand. At the end, in a typical system, we have three types of clocks. So first of all, we have the wall clock. We have mentioned that already. That's provided by the grandmaster, and local a copy of those time resides inside the individual nodes. We can derive a media clock from that time. And once we start streaming, the streams have their own clock, the RTP clock or stream clock, which in our case is strictly to follow the media clock or is being derived from the media clock. Now let's look at an illustration again, which makes things much clearer. So we have a sender and receiver. We have a grandmaster clock. We have local clocks in all the devices, and these local clocks are synchronized through PTP. So essentially, we have the same time in both devices. Now, we tell each device to generate a media clock, let's say 48 kilohertz, and since we have the same time, we will see the same frequency on both sides of the system. So we see you have exactly the same media clock, not just frequency-wise, but also phase-wise, which is important to align audio samples against each other. So now once we start streaming data, we use the media clock to sample the data in from any analog or digital input. And then the stream receives its own clock, which may have an offset from the media clock. It's referenced to the media clock, but may have a random offset R. So you watch the clocks, the time on the clocks closely. We have the exact same time on the grandmaster clock, the local clock, and the virtual clock, which is used to generate the media clock, but we have a deviating clock on the RTP stream. Now, this offset R is, of course, established upon stream startup, and it may be random for every individual stream. The idea behind that is when RFC 3550 was generated, which is the standard for RTP streaming, the guys were a little bit worried about crypto text attacks because if you use encrypted RTP streams, the timestamp is transported inside the encrypted area, and if you would know the offset or have an equal offset for all streams, it's easier to start some crypto attacks. But however, it's important that the offset is, of course, constant throughout the stream's lifetime. It doesn't change once the stream is established. It stays at its value. But the receiver needs to know this value, otherwise it couldn't align this stream against other incoming streams. And so the offset is conveyed from the sender to the receiver through an out-of-band communication, and that is done through SDP. There's an attribute in the SDP file, which is called media clock direct, and that carries the offset value of that particular stream. Now, while AES67 follows these recommendations, SMPTE 2110 has looked at this random offset recommendation and came to the conclusion it's not important within their working environment, and they want to make things easier. So they require the stream clock offset has to be 0 for every stream. So in other words, every stream looks at as being started at the very same time as all the other streams. So they are precisely aligned just by looking at the timestamp of the individual streams without having to take a random offset into account. Now, how does that look like in an RTP packet? Let's look at an RTP packet here. So this is a typical, or this is the outline of an RTP layer 5 packet. We have a header, which carries some information about the stream, and we have the payload area, which carries the actual essence data. Now, within the header, there's a 32-bit field. It's called a timestamp. And now it's important to understand that with linear PCM audio, this basically is a media clock counter. So it actually tells the receiver at which media clock counter value the first sample in the essence area had been generated. So it's not giving you a precise absolute wall clock time. It's just a referring media clock counting value of the media clock counter of the sender. Now, since the media clock counter follows the local copy of the wall clock and just has a random offset with respect to this to its instantiation point, or the 0 point of the International Atomic Time, which is the 1st January of 1970. That's where all the things start. It can tell you precisely when a particular sample had been generated. Now, you have to take into account it's a 32-bit value. And so we will see at 48 kilohertz audio sample clock a rollover roughly occurring once per day. So since we are talking real time, this doesn't pose any problem. If we were not talking about real time, this mechanism sure would not work to uniquely identify when a particular sample would have been generated. But we're talking about real time, and no stream would ever take more or longer than 1 day to travel from sender to receiver. So that's perfectly okay. For the calculations, you just have to take the modulo 32-bit equation into account. Now, so that's how the receiver exactly knows when a particular sample in a received packet has been generated with respect to absolute wall clock time. And now the next thing we want to have is a fixed and determinable latency. And that has been done by configuring a suitable link offset between the generation of a sample and the actual playout. So let's have a quick look at an illustration taken from AES67. We have the ingress time point. So that's the time when a sample gets into the sender device. That's the ingress time reference point. Then we have the 1588 measurement planes. These are not so offset measurement. And we have the desired time when a particular sample had to be played out by the receiver. So Here are the magic numbers. We have the RTP timestamp of the first sample in the packet. That is exactly the ingress time reference point. This is recorded into the RTP header. Then we determine a link offset, let's say something like 3 millisecond, 5 millisecond, 10 millisecond for the desired playout at the receiver side. So we set a determinable and fixed link offset is what we want to achieve. So then we add this link offset to the RTP timestamp. Then we subtract any given random offset of the stream clock. Remember, in ST2110, this operation is not necessary because it's per definition 0, but in AES67, it can be any value given provided by the SDP. And that calculation exactly gives you on the receiving side the playout time for a particular sample. And this stays stable for the whole time of the stream. All right, and then the final thing we need to look at is now we have one stream fixed and determinable in terms of latency. How do we do interstream alignment between different streams? Well, of course, we can take the timestamps again and compare those and align them against their timestamps, their original timestamps. So we want to have a two streams being played out sample accurately. We need to just make sure that on the receiver side, those samples are played out at the very same time if they have been generated at the same time. So here's a typical production workflow illustration. Image is courtesy of Andy Rayner from Nevion. I just like the idea, he had painted it here. So we have a video camera, a video flow here, which goes to several processing stages and is then being played out on a monitor, wall view, or whatever. We have a accompanying audio stream captured with a microphone going through an audio processor and through a speaker. We can see that the link time, the overall time the stream needs to travel from microphone to speaker is shorter than for the video stream. So what we definitely need is to tell the speaker to hold up the play out of a particular sample for a longer time, for a certain time, in order to match the alignment with the video frame which has been generated at the same point in time. That's just because the audio samples arrive much earlier at the speaker than video information going through all this processing chain. So basically, that is the alignment point. We just buffer audio or media until it reaches its desired playout time. Actually, in IP, all the devices have these kind of buffers because they need to take care of any occurring jitter which may have occurred on the network, because it's all packet networks. Packets receive jitter on the network. Now, if we closely look at this, we still have a problem because, as you've seen in the previous illustration, we have various processing stages lined up sequentially. And now that poses a problem because, as per definition of AES67 or 2110, any stream leaving a device, even an intermediate processing device, is by definition a new stream. And that has a new alignment with respect to the wall clock time, and the alignment of the original essence is lost. So we actually don't know how to compare timestamps at the end devices by just looking at these timestamps, because they are just new timestamps with respect to their generation inside the respective sender device. So what possible solutions do we have at hand to cope with this situation? Well, some suggest to use the original time alignment even for those new streams. So that means that once a stream comes into the device, a processing device, and leaves that processing device, it should reuse the old timestamps throughout the several stages. So some difficulties are connected with this suggestions. The offset increases and finally might be too large for some downstream receiving buffers. Then what timestamps would you use if you are mixing essence? So what's the reference for a mixed essence stream you're generating? And then if you look at particular implementations, sometimes you only have an I/O board which takes streams in, forwards it to the audio interface of a host device, and then gets audio back. So how should the processing, how should this device actually know what is the relationship content-wise as well as timing-wise between things I sent to my host and other media I got from my host. So this needs to be addressed, and if you want to go with the original or reusage of the original timestamps. Now, others suggest carry the origin timestamps, so the original generation timestamps, as in-band metadata. In-band metadata means you have to transport them within the RTP packet stream. So that either requires a new payload format, which carries the audio essence data plus audio metadata, or you would need to make use of the still experimental RTP header extension mechanism. I've shown you the RTP packet setup, and there's space for an extended header content, which can be variable in size, but this again poses another problem because it decreases the audio payload segments, so you just don't know excuse me, if you still have enough size for the payload you want to transport in a certain packet. And then there's a third option, which means carry the origin timestamps as out-of-band metadata. So do not transport anything within the RTP in this well-known, well-proven RTP mechanism, but tell a hosting or management device, okay, these have been the original timestamps of a particular streams, and all the subsequent generated process streams refer to the same original constant, and thus consequently, if you want to align this, you have to set these and these and these play out times or link offsets for the participating devices. Well, that requires an additional instance, of course, usually a network management system, broadcast controller, something like this, and of course, a new standard which is capable of carrying this original timestamps. But there is works going on in AES and SMPTE and even in NMOS, so there's a good chance that we'll see something emerging quite soon. So what can we do in the meantime? What's the current solution for this? Leave the alignment task to a management layer, let's say a broadcast controller or even a human brain. Devices can report their processing delay to the broadcast controller, or simply people just know from the behavior of the devices what a particular delay would be. And then the brain or the broadcast controller can configure the required reception delay for subsequent stages. So this looks like this. We have a controlling device added to the whole scheme, and that is taking reports in from all the processing devices, what their particular processing delays would be, and then can calculate the overall required delay for the individual instances, and can finally set or tell a playout device what would be the alignment delay or the link offset which would have been used with respect to the most recent stage here, in order to have a full alignment from camera, audio, microphone signals through various processing stages at the point of reception or further playout. So that's it. Find more resources on RAVENNA AES67 2110. Just go to the RAVENNA network site. Under the resources section, there's quite a lot of stuff regarding anything, AES67 2110. Also, on the Meinberg side, there are two important points where you want to start your research. It's the info page and it's the blog page. The blog page is a strong recommendation from my side. I've learned a lot some years ago when I followed the blog entries from Doug Arnold, who is one of the, the PTP gurus out there. And so these are two or three addresses which you definitely should turn to if you have any further questions. And that's it for now. So thank you for those who are still with us. Quite a lot of people stayed for the 15-minute overtime. Watch out for the recording and the slide deck to come. And thank you all for participating. And thank you, Daniel, for joining us today, and Roland for coordinating everything for the session. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Andreas, for the invitation.
Welcome.